Is John the Baptist actually responsible for Jesus' death? Throughout the Gospels, we can easily see the connections between John the Baptist and Jesus. They're related to one another. John comes to prepare the way for Jesus. They even share disciples. But there's also something dark connecting John and Jesus. Something about John that will ultimately connect him with the death of Jesus. An event in Mark's Gospel that few people even notice, but something that will ultimately make us wonder, is John partly responsible for Jesus' death? But first, if you love learning insights about the Bible and want to see connections between shows like The Chosen and the Bible that will transform the way you read Scripture, then click the link above and down in the description where you can download my free resource called 7 Biblical Secrets Hidden in The Chosen. This will show you connections to Scripture and the first century world of Jesus that are present in the show, but most people don't notice. We've packed a whole lot of information into a really small package, just like this video. Speaking of, let's dive in. Now, in order to understand this connection between John and Jesus' death, we actually have to look at a strange moment that occurs in Mark's Gospel. Mark 3 begins, and he entered into the synagogue again, and a man who had a withered hand was there. And they were watching him closely to see if he would heal on the Sabbath, in order that they could accuse him. Now, I want you to notice the first thing that Mark said there. He said, and Jesus entered into the synagogue again. Now, this is the Greek word palein. And it's Mark's way of saying, remember what happened the last time Jesus was here? And if we look back, what we'd see is that the last time Jesus was in the synagogue was in chapter 1 of Mark. That time, Jesus healed a man possessed with an unclean spirit. But more importantly, people recognize that Jesus is someone who preaches with authority, unlike the scribes. You see, this moment was the beginning of the tension between Jesus and the religious leaders, which explains why this time, the religious leaders were watching him closely to see if he would heal on the Sabbath in order that they might accuse him. This time, they're setting him up. They've seen that Jesus lets his disciples pluck grain on the Sabbath, that he doesn't follow other religious traditions like fasting. So this time, they want to put him in a position where he'll be tempted to do something truly problematic, heal on the Sabbath. You see, according to Exodus, profaning the Sabbath was a capital offense. They could potentially have Jesus executed for doing this kind of work on the Sabbath. And what we're about to see is going to put their interpretation of that law to the test. Because in the next verse it says, and Jesus said to the man who had the withered hand, come into the middle. And he said to them, is it permitted on the Sabbath to do good or to do evil, to save life or to kill? But they were silent. Now, here's what's so interesting about this. These men are setting Jesus up, putting him to the test. But instead, he flips things around and begins to test them. He's concocting a situation where they have to wrestle with their own interpretation of the law. You see, at the time of Jesus, there were exceptions to the Sabbath restrictions. For instance, you were permitted to break the Sabbath for the purposes of saving a life. That's what Jesus is referencing with his question. But the difficulty here is this one of those moments? Is a withered hand a life or death situation? The religious leaders have to struggle with this, which explains their silence. But their silence also has another dimension to it. Their silence is driven by their animosity towards Jesus. They don't say anything because they don't want to create excuses for Jesus. As Mark tells us, they've come to this place prepared to accuse him. They want to see if he will screw up. So look at what Jesus does. Instead, Mark continues, and looking around at them with anger, grieved at the hardness of their hearts, Jesus said to the man, stretch out your hand. And he stretched it out, and his hand was restored. And the Pharisees went out immediately with the Herodians and began to conspire against him with regard to how they could kill him. And it's here that we start to see the connections to John the Baptist. Because think about what just happened. First off, what did Jesus really do wrong? I mean, Jesus didn't perform some complicated ritual. He didn't exert all kinds of effort. He spoke. Like, that's literally all that he did. He said, stretch out your hand, and the man was healed. Does that really break the Sabbath? No, there's no restriction against speech on the Sabbath. So why are they so angry? Well, this is where Mark's opening words become so important for us to remember and pay attention to. Do you remember what he said? He said, and he entered into the synagogue again, and a man who had a withered hand was there. He wants us to see the connections between this event and the previous time Jesus was in the synagogue. Because do you remember what sparked the tension between Jesus and the religious leaders the last time? People looked at Jesus and they said, he speaks with authority, unlike these religious leaders. He showed them up. And he's not the only one. Matthew's gospel tells us that John said, "You brood of vipers, who warned you to flee from the coming wrath? The axe is already at the root of the trees, and every tree that does not produce good fruit will be cut down and thrown into the fire." John says this before Jesus even begins his ministry, which means that the religious leaders have been facing this opposition for a long time. John has been undermining their authority, and now Jesus is too. John has paved the way for their hatred of Jesus. But then the connections go even deeper. Because notice what the Pharisees do after Jesus undermines them. They go to the Herodians and start figuring out how they can kill Jesus. And if you know the story of John the Baptist, you know just how foreboding this reference is. Because it's the Herodians, specifically Herod Antipas, who have John in custody as Jesus has this encounter. And the Herodians who will ultimately put John to death. In other words, the same people who put John to death are now going after Jesus. But the connections aren't even done there. Because so far, Mark has shown us why John's acts have led the religious leaders to go after Jesus. But now, he's going to show us why the Herodians do as well. Mark says, "And Jesus went away with his disciples to the sea, and a great crowd from Galilee followed him. And from Judea, and from Jerusalem, and from Idumea, and the other side of the Jordan, and around Tyre and Sidon, a great crowd came to him, because they heard all that he was doing." And when you begin to look up these locations on the map, you quickly realize why this bodes so ominously for Jesus. The first place Mark mentions is the sea. And what he's talking about here is specifically the Sea of Galilee. This is generally going to be what the Gospels are referring to whenever they use the term the sea. Then Mark goes out a little more broadly and says a crowd is coming from Galilee. And what he means here is the Galilee region, the broader area surrounding the sea. Now, none of these places is really surprising. Jesus' ministry is centered in Galilee. Of course, crowds would come from there. But what catches the attention of those living back then is that all of this is territory that belongs to Herod Antipas. Jesus' power and influence is growing in Herod's territory and beyond. Mark next says that crowds are coming from Judea, which is this large region down here in southern Israel. He says that they come from Jerusalem, the capital city, the home of the temple, the center of religious life in Israel. And he says that they come from Idumea, this region way down here, the home of Herod the Great. But even then, Mark's not done. He says that also people come from the other side of the Jordan and from up north in the areas of Tyre and Sidon. And all of a sudden, it becomes clear what Mark is describing. Because almost all of these regions belong to the Herods. The ancient Jewish historian Josephus says that Herod feared John because John's influence was growing and might lead to rebellion. But here, it is clear that Jesus' influence far exceeded that of John. And what scared Herod about John terrifies him about Jesus. So, was John responsible for Jesus' death? The answer is, kind of. The truth is, John paves the way for many of the things that will ultimately lead to Jesus' death. He begins the arguments with religious leaders that will eventually reach Jesus. He sparks the fear in the Herodians that will engulf them when they see the crowds following Jesus. And most importantly, he is the prophet who paves the way. The truth is, Jesus would have chosen to die for us regardless of what John did or Herod feared. His life isn't taken from him, he gives it freely. But does John help pave the way for those events to unfold? Absolutely. And as strange as it may sound, we're thankful for it. Now, before you go, if you haven't done it yet, click the link above and down in the description to download the free resource, 7 Biblical Secrets Hidden in The Chosen. And if you'd like to see even more videos breaking down episodes of The Chosen, then just click this link right here. Thank you so much for watching. Have a great week, and we'll see you next time.